All right, so here we go, the latest round of bottle basics. For those of you that haven't been watching this or that are tuning in for the first time, these are really intended to be off the cuff, single take videos that break down the things that you'll find on some of the bottles in our portfolio. So today we are breaking down High and Wicked Singular Limited Release number 7 Foursquare. So this is from the Singular Limited Release line of High and Wicked's whiskeys, which are all, just as the name states, single limited releases. They are one and done. When they are gone, they are gone. Now, fortunately, this one did make a little bit more than some in the past, so it is going to be around for a bit. But let's break down what's on the label here. So again, on our tear strip enclosure, as we kind of discussed in the past, we've got the High and Wicked logo at the top, and then we've got High and Wicked number 7. So this is denoting that this is the 7th release in the line of singular limited releases. In the top quadrant here, we've got the name of of this particular release, which is Foursquare, quote unquote, Mark 10, 2007, end quote, finish. And that is because we are paying special respects to this being finished not just in any old rum barrel, but in a rum barrel specifically coming from Foursquare, rum distillery in Barbados, which we are fortunate enough to also be the importer of the exceptional casks, and specifically from the Mark 10 2007 release, which is pretty insane. And that was a multi-award winning release. So very exciting for that particular one to be in here. We'll talk more about that in a moment. As we kind of move around the compass here, obviously you've got the High and Wicked logo in the middle. In the bottom quadrant, we have the kind of the legal definition of what the thing is, and this is a fun one to break down. We of course have 50% alcohol by volume or 100 proof. We went ahead and did the math there, which is simple in case you didn't know. Proof is always ABV times 2. Or if you want to reverse engineer that, if you take proof and divide it by 2, guess what? You've got the ABV. 750 milliliters, again, because those are some of the required things on there. Now, technically, this is a single grain Irish whiskey. And it is finished in Ex Foursquare 2007 Barbados rum casks. Now, what is single grain Irish whiskey? Single grain Irish whiskey is actually probably the least known subcategory of Irish, typically used as a blending component. Now, if you see an Irish whiskey, like some of your kind of big mainstay brands, and obviously within proximity to St. Patrick's Day, this conversation is pretty relevant. Many of those are just blended Irish whiskeys. Now, when you look at the different variations from there, you can have single malt Irish whiskey, single pot Irish whiskey, and then of course single grain Irish whiskey. This means that this is a grain whiskey from a single distillery. It is not one grain, which is commonly misunderstood. So this is a grain whiskey from a single distillery. Now, what separates that from malt whiskey or from the pot still whiskey that you'll find in Ireland has to do with the addition of malted barley, or in the instance of the pot still whiskey, the blend of malted and unmalted barley that's being used. So single grain, again, is a grain whiskey and often distilled on a traditional twin column coffee still, or in some cases can also be distilled on a multi-column still. Those are continuous stills, which the twin column coffee still was also invented in Ireland, although is not often seen as, well, it's not seen as often in Irish whiskey. It's seen a lot more commonly in Scotch whiskey and in Barbados rum, even. In fact, at the rums coming from Foursquare, many of them have some traditional twin column coffee. Actually, almost all of them have traditional twin column coffee distilled rum in the blend. I digress. So a single grain Irish whiskey, finished in Ex Foursquare 2007 Barbados rum casks. It is important that we designate that these were Barbados rum casks, so that for those that are not familiar with the Foursquare name, they at least understand what this finish might lend to the project. So as we keep going around in the quadrants here, if we go to the left quadrant, we have the mash bill. The mash bill, again, is the different proportions of grain that are used in the fermenting mash that then constitute the flavor of the end spirit. Now, in this instance, again, remember this is a single grain Irish whiskey, so it's a grain whiskey, but not a single grain. So it is 95% French maize. This is actually an heirloom varietal of corn, and from my information, it's actually sourced specifically from around Provence in France. So this again is an heirloom corn varietal, 95% corn and 5% malted Irish barley. So for those of you that might be bourbon fans out there, this mash bill may actually look closer like a bourbon mash bill you might find in the United States, but especially some of your lighter corn whiskeys you find in the U.S. 95% corn and 5% Irish malted barley. So again, an heirloom varietal of French corn here, and specifically corn that was grown around Provence. Next, when we go over to the right-hand side quadrant, these are kind of like some of the other fun details. So this is 1,959-liter cases, released September 2023, and double cask matured, meaning that this was aged first in ex-bourbon barrels, and then it was finished in those Ex Foursquare 2007 rum casks. Now, like all of the labels for the singular limited releases from High and Wicked, we cram literally as much information into this outer rim as we can fit, as well as we can legally share. So many of the details here are things that we try to include that we believe adds either provenance to the whiskey or tells you something interesting about the product profile itself, how it was distilled, and how that practice is going to affect the flavor in the whiskey. So here, if I kind of start near the very top, we'll kind of start here with non-chill filtered. Some cloudiness may occur. Now, as you'll notice, this appears actually on almost every single one, on every single one of the High and Wicked labels. And that's because we abide by a non-chill filtered process. In fact, we minimally filter all of the whiskeys because the goal here is we want to retain as much flavor as possible. Any level of filtration arguably does extract some of the aromatic and flavor compounds in the spirit, and so we don't filter it to leave that in there. Moving along, distilled in County Cork in a continuous coffee column still. So we are defining that it is both continuous distillation and that it is a traditional twin column coffee design that's being used here. It is not a multi-column still. Those multi-columns are used more traditionally for things like vodka or neutral spirits. So what we're getting out of this still is still very flavorful. In fact, having tasted this base distillate before it was longer aged and then finished, I can tell you that the base itself was very creamy, very lactic. It had very nice kind of vanillin notes, like good vanilla development in it, but it had this very kind of creamy and heavy mouthfeel, which is very different from a lot of the Irish whiskeys that I had encountered, in that it's, many of them are very ethanol forward. And the ethanol, obviously it's in here, it's alcohol, but it was very subdued. And so you have lots of like beautiful, delicate layers, and also completely understand why Mr. Noel Sweeney, who is the blender and finisher behind this project, why he opted for rum casks on this in particular. And we'll talk about that again in a moment. So continuous coffee column still, turning the bottle upside down so I can keep reading here naturally. Aged in ex-bourbon barrels and finished for 6 months in casks used for aging 12-year single blended rum. Now, why is that important? Okay, when you see that it was for 6 months in casks used for aging 12-year single blended rum. A single blended rum is a rum coming from a single distillery, in this case Foursquare. And a blended rum here has to do with the fact that they're utilizing both twin column coffee still rum as well as double retort pot still rum. So the rums that were in these barrels that were holding rum that was up to 12 years of age meant that there was significant flavor development that had occurred in the rums themselves before those casks were emptied and then sent to Ireland to age this distillate. That actually is really important. The 12-year aging also tells you that the rum that was in here, whether you had tasted the Mark 10 2007 or not, or whether you were aware that it was a multi-award-winning rum, all of that is irrelevant because you could at least know that the rums that were aged in those casks were 12 years of age. So those casks absorbed extremely concentrated rum character, and the fact that it had both twin column coffee distilled rum and double retort pot still rum by being a single blended rum. You also knew that there was both heaviness and bright qualities to the rums that were in those casks. So that little bit of detail might seem arbitrary, but actually is really important to tell you what's going on with the liquid. Now, when Noel reached out, Noel mentioned in particular that he had some really great single grain whiskey that he was working with, some single grain Irish, and that he really wanted to finish it in these in some rum casks. And we told him, as opposed to just going and getting any old casks on the market, that we would love to see him kind of collaborate with Richard on this. And Richard being the master distiller and master blender, the fourth generation at the Foursquare Rum Distillery in Barbados. And in particular, if they could find some casks that came from this exceptional cask selection line, that for one, we would be like over the moon about it, but that we also believed that it would have significant character and flavor. And I will tell you, and I know this isn't a tasting video, but as far as the character and flavor of this spirit, this is epic. I mean, this is, and almost nearly every account or person I've tasted on this has said this is one of the absolute best Irish whiskeys I've ever had. I've never had an Irish whiskey like this before. This is incredible. How much of this can I get? Can I get more of it? So this really is some truly special stuff, because you're dealing with Noel Sweeney, and Noel Sweeney is the former master distiller and blender from Cooley in Ireland, which then became Teelings. So many people are familiar with Teelings, but Noel himself is to date one of the most awarded distillers and blenders across all categories of whiskey. He was inducted to the UK's Whiskey Hall of Fame in 2017, and he is the current, well, actually, I need to double check this, but last I knew, he was the sitting president for the Irish Whiskey Denomination of Origin, so overseeing all of Irish whiskey. Needless to say, Noel has an incredible palate and is extremely knowledgeable about the category. And so when Noel mentioned that he was working on this project and that he wanted to work with some rum casks, we were like, well, obviously you are an icon, a legend, a master in your own right. What would happen if we put you together with Richard Seal, who he himself is also an icon, legend, and master in his category? So Irish whiskey and rum coming together here, and the end result is gorgeous. As far as the back label, we do have the bottling information, which actually has come up in conversation quite a bit. So this does state that this is bottled by High and Wicked in Crestwood, Kentucky. And I've had a number of people bring up to me, well, why is this an Irish whiskey that's bottled in Kentucky? Well, realistically, we'll cover a couple of things. For one, Irish whiskey can be bottled outside of Ireland. Now, generally, we take a pretty strong stance of we like things to be bottled at the source, right? Like our Kentucky straight bourbon and Kentucky straight rye, distilled, matured, blended, bottled entirely in Kentucky. When it comes to Foursquare, also distilled, matured, blended, and bottled entirely in Barbados. Much of the singular limited release line of High and Wicked was being developed during the pandemic. And during this period, we were dealing with significant delays due to lockdown, due to glass shortages, due to cork shortages, you name it. And so this release, and actually a lot of our Irish releases thus far, went into this particular bottle, which was originally selected for our American whiskeys in the singular limited release line. Because we had available glass and we had it available in Kentucky. And the Irish Whiskey Denomination of Origin allows for it to be bottled outside of Ireland. And so in doing so, it was easier for us to actually get this whiskey over to Kentucky and get it bottled to get it to the American market than it was to try and get the glass and everything else figured out on the Irish side of things, at least during that period during lockdown. That doesn't mean that this is always going to be the bottle that we're in, but to date it is. So some of the details there. The other thing that I do want to mention about this, I've had several folks bring up that there's no declared age statement on here. It does state double cask matured. It does state that it's finished for 6 months in Ex Foursquare casks, but it was also aged in Ex bourbon barrel. And we don't declare the age statement because in talking with Noel, he mentioned that the standard, or at least a majority of those releasing whiskeys in Ireland opt to not include an age statement if it is less than 10 years old. And so because Noel was at the helm on this, we also agreed, like, let's abide by the same standard here. We don't need to declare the age because, frankly, that number in the American consumption market generally does become an arbitrary standard for measuring quality. And many of us agree that that should not be the case, that the longer something is aged does not necessarily connotate better quality or better value. Certainly, it does impact the cost of the distillate because you're dealing with more evaporated things. But not every distillate or spirit works well with really long age. In fact, sometimes you want your whiskeys to be a little bit closer to the grain because you want that kind of sweeter, fruitier characteristic of the actual freshly distilled spirit still present in there. Now, of course, like I mentioned, there are plenty of other things out there and other spirits that do benefit significantly from long aging, and really some mind-blowing wild flavors develop. But that process of extraction and evaporation and filtration that occurs inside the cask does remove things that you have when the whiskey is still younger. Now, I can tell you, this isn't like just new make, very lightly aged. This does have a decent amount of age on it, but it is less than 10 years, and so we did abide by the standard here that Noel suggested, which is double cask matured rather than a full-on age statement. So, if you can find this, Rob Report just named this Best Single Grain Irish Whiskey. It is already starting to take awards. It is just launching around the United States. And honestly, this was one of the most challenging spirits in that the first time I tasted it, I had no idea what I was tasting. It was complex. It was crazy. It was unlike any Irish whiskey I had tasted personally prior to this, and has quickly become one of my favorite bottles at the house when I'm cracking open something just to drink for me. And that is to say that obviously I'm biased, but I try to not get high on my own supply all the time. This is one that I do find myself gravitating towards, and my father-in-law and I also very much enjoy this one. So if you're a cigar fan, great pairing with a cigar, but frankly, delicious neat, delicious in cocktail, delicious on the rocks. High and Wicked Foursquare, single grain Irish whiskey, just hitting the market. For those of you that celebrate or have celebrated, not sure when you're watching this, but happy St. Patrick's Day. We'll show you officially the longest bottle basics so far. Cheers.